Welcome to ILTV's Insider. I'm Steve Leibowitz. During about 50 years in Israel, I recall a few days as painful and divisive as yesterday. The signing of the Oslo Accords, the pullout from Gush Katif, the murder of Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, all fractured the fabric of Israeli society. Now the deed of yesterday is done. The first part of the contentious plan of judicial reform presented by Yariv Levin is law. So we are now, you could say, post-reasonableness. Joining us to discuss all the developments are Alon Tal, former Knesset member for the National Unity Party led by Benny Gantz, and a leading expert on environmental affairs, and Mitchell Barak, a former aide to Prime Minister Netanyahu and now head of Kivun Strategies and an expert pollster. Let me start with you, Alon. Has a dramatic, first of all, I got to say, I noticed that the sun came out this morning. Has a dramatic fundamental change taken place in the state of Israel? How would you define Israeli democracy after yesterday's vote?
Yesterday, Israeli democracy got a punch in the stomach. We took a hit. The public's ability to stand up to an authoritarian executive branch is highly diminished. But more than that, our quality of life stands to suffer. Let me just give you an example from my world, the environmental world. The so-called reasonableness argument is something that has been at the heart of pretty much all environmental progress in Israel. Just last month, I was one of the two petitioners to the Supreme Court who forced the Ministry of Environment to pass regulations for clean water that had been sitting there for 4 years because it was patently unreasonable that the whole world had done it. The ministry came to my committee when I was chair of the Environmental Committee of the Knesset and said they do it, and they didn't. And the Supreme Court said, you have 3 months to do it. The history of this country is filled with situations where an ineffective or a corrupt executive branch had its feet held to the fire. And now that we don't have that opportunity, an executive branch which already enjoys almost unfettered power because of a fairly, I would say, anemic legislative branch, will unfortunately be able to basically do what it wants. It's inappropriate appointments, and in the present case, the real motivation behind this, appointing a convicted criminal, Aryeh Deri, to the position of minister in contravention of his own promise. And now the ability of the public to stand up to that is highly diminished. Yes, it's a very, very sad day for democracy, and many of us in Israel are very sad.
Mitchell, you worked for Prime Minister Netanyahu and you witnessed all kinds of political moves. Are you surprised that he went through with this move of yesterday despite warnings from everyone, from the IDF Chief of Staff to the President of the United States?
Well, I worked for him almost 30 years ago. I can tell you I don't think he's changed very much during that time. And why should he? He's been elected and reelected prime minister. Why change your, what everyone would say is undesirable or bad behavior if it keeps winning? And that's what he keeps doing. I think I was a little surprised. I mean, it didn't become about the actual law and the judicial reform. It got to the point where he was being managed, and everyone says this, by the extreme elements in his coalition and his partners. Yariv Levin was not going to back down. Ben Gvir and Smotrich were not going to back down, and they were threatening to bring down the government, and they just might have. So that was on the one hand, is that I don't think he was really in control of what he could do. The other issue is that it became the fact that people in the army or who were volunteering for the army were threatening not to go. So if you give in to that blackmail or those threats, which I think are legitimate because they were volunteering and they feel that they can't volunteer anymore in this what looks like a dictatorship in some ways, then what's going to happen the next time the government wants to do something? Whether it's something like the disengagement, which Finance Minister Netanyahu voted for 3 times in the cabinet, although he opposed it, but he voted 3 times with the government. So, you know, are people going to say we're not going to participate in a disengagement? We're not going to participate in this, operation in Jenin. We're not going to, it becomes the Burger King army. Have it your way. I want it with the pickles. I want it without the pickles. And I think that's what happened. But I was surprised because, and it may change at this point, not just because the Supreme Court may rule that they can't do it because it's unreasonable, ironically, but Netanyahu does seem to want to climb off the tree and come to some kind of agreement. The typical Netanyahu mode of operation here is lose-lose. Go all the way, do the damage, and then don't go through with it. So you lose on both accounts by getting everyone angry and upset and then not going through with it, like he did with Benny Gantz's defense minister. He fired him, got everyone angry for that, replaced him. He didn't get any benefit from it. He lost on all accounts. No one respected him anymore because he let Gantz in. He ruined it for people when he fired Gantz. That's the way it works.
I think you're speaking of Yoav Gallant, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, yes, Yoav Gallant. I know you work with Gantz, but I will take this opportunity to say, for the guys that are opposed to Netanyahu, you certainly gave him a lifeline in that government when you bucked, Yair Lapid, when you ran together after 3 times and then formed the government with him. That's his political lifeline right there. That's the lead up. You should take some responsibility for that too.
I do take responsibility. Just to respond to that, first of all, I agree with just everything you said, but there is a time in our nation's history, especially when 1/3 of the people are unemployed, many people are sick, and we don't know that there's a vaccination down the road, when leaders do what's best for the country. And I think what's so tragic about yesterday is that it was clear that the side of the opposition or the people who are protesting were willing to have a compromise. And yet, because, just like you said, the extremist elements insisted, they didn't do that. And the right thing for the country, of course, was to bring us all together and emphasize what brings us. And there were things we could agree about. And it's just such a tragedy that we let the extremists win the day yesterday.
Well,
Benny Gantz did not.
And wait, if I could say, one of the best members of Knesset was Alon Tal. And it's unfortunate that he's not in today. And I know exactly what he did for the environment, and he was a very conscientious member of Knesset.
We all agree about that, and we would all like to see Alon back in the Knesset. I think we're speaking both for the opposition and the coalition right now, just for the environment's sake. But let's move on. Yesterday, Alon, I was literally on the barricades covering the story at the Knesset at the hour when the vote was taken. And I decided to just look around into the faces of the people that were standing around me and thinking, there is no quit in these people. They're also very, very gentle people, meaning I was in protests for the Soviet Jewry movement in the streets of New York, and we went against the police. And I have to say, there was a whole lot more violence in those protests, mostly started by us, I must say. But when I look around at those people, they're determined to continue with these protests, aren't they?
Absolutely. I think that people realize that if this full package of reforms goes through, Israel will be a very different place. And we got a reminder this morning when there was the Likud, after basically disparaging volunteer pilots and volunteer reservists as people who are going AWOL, said, oh, and we're going to make this legal for 12-13% of the population and make the Torah law, which will exempt ultra-Orthodox from the draft. So people realize where this is going. We realize that there are ministers in the government who are now proposing that the issue of child support be taken away from civil courts and be sent to rabbinical courts, which do not allow women to provide evidence, and of course are run by male rabbis. So we see this sort of trends, and people want to have a future here. I have 2 daughters studying abroad. One's getting a PhD, the other one is working in climate tech. I have to look them in the eye and say, come back to Israel, you have a place to live here. But as a country that's moving in this slippery slope towards a totalitarian culture, a culture that stomps the opposition, even if there are 1 or 2 vote differences, the main thing is to show who's in power. That's not a country that they want to come back to, that people want to raise their kids to. And what frightens me most, Steve, what frightens me the most is that so many of the people that I really respect most are seriously talking about leaving. They don't want their children to serve in an army in which the deputy minister of defense talks about wiping out, erasing an entire Palestinian village, where the head of police is a big believer in Kahana and an unrepentant racist. So these are real concerns that people who've kept Israel going, the economy and the security, are really reaching the end of their rope. I hope that you're right, that the people who are protesting realize that this can be won, and that there's no time it's time to double down in our country. But there are voices which are starting to show weakness, and that frightens me.
Experience the power of truth with ILTV News. If you're looking for quality content and captivating visuals, join our news community and become an integral part of our team as we embark on a mission to unveil the real Israel, dismantling the web of lies and misinformation that surround reporting on Israel. By subscribing to ILTV News, you will not only have access to the latest updates, but you will also amplify our message, creating a ripple effect that carries the truth far and wide. Subscribe today and help reshape the narrative. Available on the web, Android, and Apple.